Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
My pleasure to be on.
We are beginning a new series on concubines. And Dr. Shabir, this series is spurred on by a question we received from a viewer. So the viewer said, why did the Prophet choose to have sex with a slave? Isn't this immoral? So this question raises all sorts of, issues, and I thought we would discuss that in this series. But Dr. Shabir, to begin, maybe you can talk about what a concubine is, and especially what it is in the Muslim context.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so basically the word concubine refers to a woman who is in a steady relationship with a man, with the difference that she is not legally married to him. So there's a distinction between the wife and the concubine, a kind of a mutually exclusive definition. So the wife is not the concubine and the concubine is not the wife. But the concubine is like a wife, but she has a sort of secondary status.
Mm-hmm. So Dr. Shabir, in your mind, what sort of questions does this raise? The person who is asking the question, obviously finds this really problematic. And in fact, he has said that, his friends are also raising this question with him. So I think it raises questions about the Prophet Muhammad, right? Was he engaging in immoral behavior? And if we're following him, then what does it mean for us, right? And then
Yes.
The Quran itself, like if the Quran mentions concubinage or having sex with slaves, then what does that mean about the Quran and this text from God that we revere so much?
Yeah, and to even give more credence to the stance of the questioner, to explain this puzzle a little bit more, why it becomes even more puzzling for Muslims is that whereas so far I've defined concubine or concubinage in a general way, it is also known in historical contexts, as we will get into in more detail eventually. That many concubines started out as slaves. So if you take if you imagine the situation where a woman is a slave already, meaning that she might have been captured in war, she might have been even sold in the open market, which is terrible, but these things happened in the past. And then if a woman then is taken and then used for sexual purposes, then we have a combined problem here. One is the problem of slavery in general, that apply to both men and women, and then the specific problem, a kind of a compounded problem in the case of women, is that not only is she a slave, but she's now used for the sexual pleasure of her master. Mm-hmm. So this is something that is so obviously unacceptable today, and the question then arises: how are Muslims going to view the reported actions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? And did he really have a concubine that he used as a wife? And if so, what does that imply? Does that mean that we have to follow him in everything that he did? Or might we say that there are some things that he did as a human being who lived a long time ago, and he acted as a morally upright person and one of the best exemplars for his time and place? Or might we say that he is an example for all time to follow, even in all of these minor details, in which case we would be in a kind of a state of confusion, mm-hmm. Knowing that that is not acceptable today, but thinking that if circumstances would permit, we would do exactly the same thing, or should do exactly the same thing. But most Muslims recognize that we would not do that today. So hence the confusion and the question. Mm-hmm. Or might we take
many Muslims are not even aware that the Prophet possibly had concubines, right? That it was even an issue.
Yes, of course, more and more Muslims are becoming aware now because of the internet, and information is being shared, and a non-Muslim may send a bit of information to a Muslim saying, hey, did you realize that your prophet was like this? And in that case, they would be referring to some reports in our classical sources saying that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had this or that concubine. So how do we regard those reports? So do we have to take those reports as being factual? Might we look at those reports with a certain reasonable degree of skepticism and look at the possibility that maybe some mistake has occurred in the way in which people thought about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and whether indeed, for example, if we talk about Maria, the Coptic woman, perhaps she was a wife and taken by the Prophet, peace be upon him, as a wife, but people misconstrued that either as a genuine mistake or for their own purposes later on to legitimate for themselves the idea that you could have a concubine and sleep with her. So that's one aspect, the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that we must look at in more detail. The other aspect, which you already asked about, is the Quran. Like, how do we regard the Quran? Is there a verse in the Quran that so clearly says that a man could have a concubine, and by virtue of just simply having this woman as a concubine, he has the right to sleep with her? Or does the Quran actually promote the marriage of the female slaves so that if a female slave was to be in a relationship, a sexual relationship with a man, then that would have to be her legitimately married husband? Or is there something in between where, for example, you have the problem of war, which nowadays, of course, we reel from the blood and violence of war, and we want peace. But looking back at historical realities, when war was very frequent and people were captured in war, what was to be done with the prisoners of war? So the special problem of the prisoners of war was dealt with in a unique way in the Medinan society of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in that they were taken and distributed as domestic servants within the Muslim community. This was, in that social context, a humane way of dealing with the slaves, where Muslims were encouraged to feed them with the same sort of quality of food that you eat and give them clothing of the same quality that you wear and so on. So that's a kind of an ideal, and not everyone did not necessarily follow all of those ideals. But within that sort of ideal thought, a woman was also one of the slaves who were distributed, and she became a domestic servant. So if there was some attraction between her and her master, then would he get married to her? Well, one way would be to free her completely and give her the choice. Do you want to get married to me or to go back to your people? But going back to her people may not have been necessarily a good move in all circumstances, because we're talking here about people who were at war with the Muslims, and you would not so freely send them back to their people. Sometimes you may see it as advantageous to release them as an act of kindness altogether. Or you may exchange them for prisoners of war that they are holding, meaning your people who have been captured in war as you have captured their people in war. So maybe an in-between would have been for such prisoners to be held temporarily. And if a woman was held in this situation temporarily, then rather than contract a permanent marriage between her and her master, perhaps this concubinage was seen as an in-between, where she could be temporarily married to her master. So she's not regarded as a full wife and as a permanent wife, but maybe she's given this kind of temporary status as a wife, and it's called differently in the Quran. So maybe something like this is at work, but we need to explore this in greater detail and discuss the ins and outs of the verses that refer or could be used as a possible reference to this practice.
I'm interested in what scholars are talking about when they discuss this issue, and if in particular they talk about the power differential between a master and a concubine, and also consent, the issue of consent. So, Dr. Shabir, I'm looking forward to this series with you. I understand that it will be a lengthy discussion, and I'm excited to learn more.
Yeah, me too. I think it's a very important discussion, and we need to bring clarity on this question. Otherwise, like our questioner, many Muslims would be in a state of confusion unless we present the matter with such clarity.
Yes, we think of concubinage as something immoral today, right? And so the question is, how could it have been practiced in the time of the Prophet, and how could the Quran condone this sort of practice? So thank you for that, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe. And please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.